Copper Sunrise. Chapter 10. The sun had sunk low in the sky by the time we reached the silent pool, and the forest had become a vague mist of unfamiliar shapes. I wondered how Tethany would be able to find his way home over the dim trails I could not follow even in the daylight. Night would bring an inky covering to everything in the woods. But Tethany's cheerful farewell gave no hint of hesitation or fear. He slipped mysteriously away through the trees and left me alone in the still twilight. I picked my way carefully along the gurgling creek bed, slipping on the smooth stones, clutching at the branches in the darkness. I began to wonder if anyone had missed me. They had. Long before I reached the village, I could hear shouts echoing through the night and see the flash of lanterns at the end of the narrow tunnel I was following. I shouted in answer, and the lanterns clustered at the tunnel's mouth ahead of me. This was the first time I had stayed away after sundown. Mama and Papa were long used to my absences, ever since I could walk, and I had gone off whenever possible on my own, but now I had overstayed the time limits. I started to arrange lies in my head to explain my late return. "Jamie, thank heaven you're safe," cried Mama, hugging me into her warm arms. The darkness had been cold. "Where were you, lad? What have you been doing?" demanded Papa sternly. "Did you not know we'd be worried about you?" I told them I was sorry for upsetting them and said I must have fallen asleep while I was fishing. I did not even have my fishing lines with me, but no one noticed, and my lie was accepted as an excuse. As we went back to the house, Robert laid his arm across my shoulder and walked beside me in silence. The candle in his lantern had gone out. I knew why he had been worried over my disappearance. I had expected to be thrashed severely with the ladle, but got only great numbers of hugs from Mama and Davy. Robert signaled me to keep quiet. I somehow managed to eat the cold fish they had saved for me. It was stale and greasy, and the clammy chunks felt horrible in my mouth, but I swallowed them quickly and washed them away with tea. I much preferred the roast caribou that Shadowthigh had given me. When Robert and I were in bed, and he was certain Davy was asleep, he began to explain what had happened that afternoon. He had been afraid, he said, that the savages had killed me, and was blaming himself for not shooting the woman he had seen at the shore. If he had not been such a coward, he felt, they might have been frightened off, and I would have been safe. I learned also that today had been a bad day to stay away from after dark. Fishermen from the Cape of Islands had called in to cut water, and during their visit had reported that there were vague rumors of savages migrating along the coast in large numbers. They usually lived in small groups, the fishermen said. The large bands meant that food was becoming scarce. To Mama, there seemed only one food they would be interested in. The savages were raiding more often along the north coast, and more things were being stolen. Sails, shovels, axes, pots, fish hooks, nails, ropes, gaffs, and harpoons. At Port Martinson, they had killed a dog and carried it off with them. So far, no deaths were reported in the north, but they had heard that several dozen savages had been shot down on the east coast. Robert knew that the savages lived in the forest, making it unsafe even by day, and nightfall only increased the risk. Night was when the savages made their raids. What if they found me? I told Robert that I had never seen anything dangerous in the forest, and he seemed somewhat relieved. But several times during the night I was awakened by his troubled tossing and groaning. In the dim light I could see beads of sweat on his forehead, and the pillow was soaked. During breakfast, Papa continued his stern lecture. Like everyone else, he had feared that I had been captured or killed by the savages and carried off to their camp. I thought once more of Tethany's camp and frowned, remembering how discourteous and unfriendly his father had seemed. Why had he not been more polite? "You know, Jamie, that if you stumbled on those wretched creatures in the forest," added Papa, "there would be very little hope for you. I don't know what they'd do to you, lad, but if one of their boys wandered in here, I'd grab Rob's rifle and blow his head open. What then would a savage do to you?" I repeated my story that nothing dangerous had ever crossed my path. I had seen fox prints once, but they had been old and faint. The matter lost its importance, and little more was said. I expected Papa to order me never to go again into the forest. Perhaps his warning was meant to forbid my trips, but I worked around it in my mind. That very afternoon I again met Tethany. We stayed at the pool to fish, he with his hands and I with my hook. He seemed to enjoy splashing about, plunging into the cold stream to grab a fish, letting it go if it was not big enough for him. Somehow he always seemed to catch the largest fish, but I managed to pull in 2 good ones. They would have made a welcome meal. I was rapidly learning his language and could understand much of what he said. He too seemed to know a greater amount of English and could follow my meaning even when I spoke of my home, which he had seen only from the top of the sighting hill. He was especially interested in hearing about Davy, for he had never seen anyone with yellow hair. He even asked me to bring Davy with me to the pool so that he could see him, but I had to refuse. My parents would have been horrified if they had known, and Davy would never have kept quiet about the trip if I had tried to bring him secretly. Tethany was afraid to come near the village, so Davy and his light hair remained a strange mystery for him. I knew, though, that Shadow Thigh was certainly no mystery for Tethany. He was half his life. He spoke proudly of the little boy, boasting of how Shadow Thigh could already shoot a bow accurately enough to hit the mark, but lacked strength to reach a bird or animal. Although Shadow Thigh's arrows often fell uselessly to the ground, Tethany felt sure the boy was destined to become a great hunter. There would be no fear of starvation when Shadow Thigh began to hunt. Tethany sang me a song of his people, describing a hunter's search for moose. He acted the roles of both the eager hunter, whose family would starve if he failed, and stately figure of the moose, whose death meant life for others. He played the part so well that I was sorry when the song ended. Then he took out his copper flute and Shadow Thigh's bone whistle. While he played the flute, I sounded the mournful note of the whistle, and the two blended into music, more remote and ghostly than even he alone could produce. Long before the sun even threatened to set, I left Tethany at the pool and returned home, making sure to come up to the house from the beach as though I had been away exploring the rocks. I watched from our small window as the sky clouded over and fog rolled in off the gray surface of the bay, and wondered about my friend in the forest. Chapter 11. The next weeks were unusually warm, and Tethany and I spent hours together, basking in the welcome sunlight, throwing pebbles at a rock or climbing to the sighting hill, which Tethany's people used to follow the movements of the caribou. We fished in the creek or swam in the fresh water of the pool. We played hide and seek among the clumps of bushes, and often we just talked. I memorized the trails and became almost as familiar with the forest as Tethany. I learned many things from my friend and taught him about life in the village. Once, after we had left his camp, I asked why his family had built the second hut. I knew they all slept together in one room, and that the other hut lay empty all the time. Tethany said nothing but led me through the forest to a part of the hill which I had never seen before. Here an overhanging ledge sheltered a row of wide cracks in the rocks, and earth had filtered down to form what looked like a series of roomy cupboard spaces, shallow caves with mossy floors. One of the openings had been blocked off with a heavy rock, and plants had begun to seal it from view. Tethany sat down on the carpet of needles that covered the forest floor and ran his hand gently across the stone that closed the first cave. He turned to me with solemn eyes. His face remained without expression while he told me about his grandfather and grandmother. They had lived in the second hut, sharing it with a younger sister of his father. A great sickness had killed his aunt, his sister, and both his grandparents, covering their bodies with tiny sores that left their skin pitted and rough. The marks could still be seen when the bodies had been washed and prepared for burial. Colored with red ochre and ornamented with beads and fine caribou skin robes. All four had been laid in the cave and the rock placed over the entrance, sealing them in their darkness. "Were you very sad when they had died, Tethany?" I asked. "Did you cry?" Yes, he had cried. He explained that his people believed that the death released the spirit of a person, freeing it to begin the long journey to the pleasant land in the west, where it could be happy forever. He had put his sister's bone flute in the cave with her body, so she would have it in the western land. She had played it well, and he had loved to hear the notes, rising and falling like the waves of the sea, or a bird sailing the unseen currents of the sky. She had been gentle. She had looked after Shadotai while his mother worked. She never complained. It had been hard to lose her. She would be happy now, free from her sickness in the new land, but he still missed her greatly. During the time of illness, he was afraid that Shadotai too might be taken from him. He would always be grateful that his little brother had lived to share his life. He paused, and I thought of Davy, how close he had come to death during our voyage. I began to wonder what it would be like if he had died of his sickness, and found myself suddenly grateful that he had lived. The feeling was new to me. I was glad he hadn't died, of course, but this sensation was deeper and stronger. I knew how Tethany felt. I asked Tethany how they knew when the spirit of a person reached the new land in the west. Did they ever return to their families? Tethany showed me the copper flute, fingering its smoothly polished surface. It glowed in the shade as he cradled it in his palm. Copper was a beautiful color, he said, the most beautiful of all. When his sister had died, he explained, they waited for the messages. Every morning the family rose before dawn, walking to the sighting hill to watch the sunrise. After a new spirit reached the west, it would send 2 messengers. One was the sun who journeyed daily to the land of the west to shine on the souls who lived there, then return to this land each morning to tell us new spirits in the pleasant country. The sun would rise from the eastern sea and shine brightly across clouds and water, bathing the world in copper-colored light, softening the land and comforting those left behind. Only when a new spirit was safely at rest did the sun have that copper glow. The second messenger always came right before or after the sun rose, appearing as a bird or sea animal. When the sun had dawned to tell of the arrival of his sister, aunt, and grandparents in the west, the family had been greeted by an eagle that swooped low over the hilltop. They were glad that the spirits would be content, but Tethany longed to hear his sister play her flute once again. There was sorrow in his eyes as he looked at me, and he blinked to erase the tears. I stood and looked away, but he understood my thoughts and rose beside me. He said that someone always came to fill the empty place of a person who left, just as I had appeared after his sister's death. He had only to await the sun's message. Together we walked slowly back to the hilltop, stopping to gather a few wild berries along the trail. Although the sun was still high overhead in the afternoon sky, Tethany slipped away from me quietly and left me to find my way home. While I slid down the moss-covered side of the hill, I heard the far-off notes of Tethany's flute, and I felt my eyes once more begin to fill. When I reached the village, I noticed Davy sitting by himself on a rock, stroking the black fur of the village dog. I walked over and picked up my little brother, who seemed to weigh less now than I remembered. He eagerly threw his arms around my neck. He must be lonely, I thought, with no one except the dog to share his world. "Let's go for a boat ride, Davy," I suggested. "Go tell Mama where you'll be." He raced off over the rocks in great excitement, the dog yelping and barking happily at his heels. I fetched the oars and bailed several buckets of stagnant greenish water from the boat. Even the rowboat seemed to be lonely, isolated and neglected among the larger dories on the beach. Over the slope towards me came Davy, leaping and bouncing, his face bright with smiles. He could go. We rowed slowly across the harbor to the tidal marshes around the point. Every time a duck or seabird flapped awkwardly from the water, with loud cries of alarm, Davy would shriek with laughter. He chattered in his shrill voice, delighted that someone would listen, fascinated by the things he saw all around him. A group of seals played water games at the harbor mouth, bobbing and diving, lunging and escaping in their own kind of tag. Davy could not take his eyes off them and wanted to stay forever, but supper time was approaching. I rowed around with one oar and then headed the boat in towards the village. We pulled the rowboat up over the pebbles of the beach, above the high tide level, where the waves could not reach it. Then we climbed the bank to the house, Davy clinging tightly to my hand, skipping along and humming to himself. At the door he stopped to face me. "Jamie," he said, "I like it when you take me with you. Can we go again?" I nodded and smiled, and Davy smiled back. His teeth were loosened at the front, and there was a space between them. Chapter 12. The tiny rocky islands off the coast were always covered with thousands of seabirds. In the spring the villagers went there to gather eggs, making the short trip across the bay in dories. When Tethany asked if I would go with him to catch seabirds on the island, I agreed readily without even thinking of the problems we would have to face. To begin with, even the two of us together could never handle a dory in the open bay. The oars for the rowboat were usually kept in someone's house. Sometimes there was even heavy traffic from the fishing grounds or along the coast. What if we were seen? But Tethany had no intention of being seen. The expedition was to be made at night before the moon was high. All I needed to do was meet him at the pool. He would arrange everything else. Foolishly, I gave my promise to come, wondering how I could ever get away to wander through the forest at night. So, of course, I did not ask permission. My whole family usually went to bed soon after sunset. Before long, the house was dark, and cautiously I rose and dressed. I searched with my bare feet along the rough wooden floorboards to find my shoes, and quietly pulled them on. I was afraid to make the faintest rustle since Robert slept lightly, often waking in terror if a door slammed in the distance or if someone dropped a boot. Stealthily, I unlatched the door and eased out, gently closing it behind me. The cool night air chilled my face and body, making small bumps march over my skin. On the clothes rope was a heavier shirt of mine, but it was still wet, and I left it hanging. I slipped silently away from the steps and across the clearing to the stream. There I paused, peering uneasily into the darkness. What if Tethany had not come? He could be ill, or lost, or confined at home. I hated to enter this gloomy cavern, where bears or worse might even now be waiting. Nervously I edged into the forest, expecting some snarling beast or horrible cry to greet me, but I had to keep my promise. The woods were unexpectedly peaceful, and even the creek noises were hushed and muffled by the inky night. I followed the trail almost from memory, hesitating at points to listen to the sounds of the water, as it gurgled over lips in the stream bed, making tiny laughing cataracts. I knew all the waterfalls on the creek, and their cheerful presence kept me company, reassuring me in the darkness. Tessany was already standing at the pool and immediately led me off down an unfamiliar trail. After a few words of greeting, he fell silent, and we followed the path without speaking for half a mile. There was no moon, but ahead I could make out the edge of the forest and the unusually still waters of the bay beyond. Tethany suddenly stepped into a dense thicket of bushes and asked me to help. Carefully hidden among the branches, so that no one walking along the beach would even notice, was a canoe. We pulled it out and carried it to the water. I was surprised at how little the craft weighed and how fragile it looked. I had never seen a canoe before. Each side was shaped like a flattened crescent moon. The little vessel was made of bark, sewn with roots over a wooden frame, waterproofed with spruce or balsam resin. Tethany held it steady while I entered, stepping carefully on the wooden ribs. He pushed it off as he swung himself into place, and handed me a carved wooden paddle. I had never before used a paddle, and I was at a loss how to handle it. Tethany said nothing, but I managed to learn how to hold it by watching him slice smoothly into the cool water, salt water. The islands were bunched like grapes a short distance from the point. We paddled swiftly along the coast and across the narrow strait, coming up along the side of the island that was safely hidden from the village. Across the harbor mouth on the shore closest to Brigantine were the salt marshes that Davy and I had visited a short time before. Tethany backed the canoe in and we lifted it ashore between two large rocks, which jutted out of the sand. I left my paddle in the canoe, but Tethany brought his with him as we stepped across the bare rocks to a higher ledge. In a few minutes we had climbed the rough slopes to the top of the narrow rocky cliffs, where thousands of gannets, puffins, auks, cormorants, and gulls were squatting in sleep. The whole island seemed to be covered with these birds, just as were all the islands along the coast. Some, like this, were home to different species. Others held only one kind. Tethany was on his knees, speaking gently to the birds. He explained that his family had no meat, that his father had gone south to hunt for caribou or moose, and his mother and brother were very hungry. He asked their pardon for disturbing them at night, but he could not come during the daylight. Then he stood up, gripped the paddle tightly, and brought it down on a large gannet. He clubbed two more birds and turned to me. "That is all we need," he said. "We can go now." I was glad to leave, for the moon had begun to rise in the cloudless sky, shining so brightly that I could see my shadow. I was afraid that late travelers coming along the coast might spot our canoe and open fire on us. They would certainly not stop to ask whether we were both savages before they started shooting. Tethany picked the birds up by their feet and carried the paddle as we headed back towards the canoe. The bay lay calm below the cliff, and the rocks were smooth and damp with dew. There between the two large boulders lay Tethany's canoe. As we approached, my foot struck something in the darkness. I felt myself falling forward.